July 15, 1918. 3 hours past midnight along the Marne River in France's Champagne region. In the pre-dawn darkness, American soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division crouch in hastily prepared positions along the southern bank, their rifles gripped tight despite the summer warmth. Many of these men arrived in France just weeks earlier, fresh from training camps in America, their uniforms still relatively clean compared to the mud-caked veterans of years-long fighting. Behind them, French artillery crews make final adjustments to their guns, ranging on predetermined coordinates where German forces are massing for an attack that Allied intelligence has been expecting for days. At precisely 12:10 in the morning, the horizon erupts in a spectacle of fire and fury. Over 6,000 German artillery pieces and mortars unleash a devastating bombardment that transforms the night into a hellish landscape of explosions and screaming metal. Shells crash into Allied positions in a carefully orchestrated pattern designed to destroy command posts, sever telephone lines, and annihilate artillery batteries before the infantry even begins to move. Gas shells mix with high explosive rounds, forcing defenders to don their uncomfortable masks while seeking what shelter they can find. For 3 hours, this mechanical storm rages across the front, the concentrated violence of industrialized warfare focused on breaking the will of men who stand between the German army and its desperate bid for victory. This was the opening of what history would record as the Second Battle of the Marne, the last major German offensive of the First World War. Yet to understand why German forces launched this attack, why it failed, and why its failure marked the true turning point of the entire war, we must step back 4 months to witness Germany's final gamble for victory on the Western Front. March 21, 1918, had dawned with the roar of German guns along an 80-kilometer front near the Somme River. Operation Michael, the first phase of what the Germans called the Kaiserschlacht, or Kaiser's Battle, represented General Erich Ludendorff's carefully planned offensive to win the war before American military power could tip the balance irrevocably toward the Allies. The strategic calculus was brutally simple. Russia's collapse into revolution and civil war had allowed Germany to transfer nearly 50 divisions from the Eastern Front to France and Belgium. For the first time since 1914, German forces outnumbered Allied troops on the Western Front, fielding 192 divisions against 178 Allied divisions. But this numerical advantage was temporary and fragile. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States was training and shipping an enormous army to France. By May 1918, over 300,000 American troops would be in France, with another million expected by August. These fresh soldiers, unbowed by years of trench warfare, represented a resource pool that Germany simply could not match. The German homeland, strangled by the British naval blockade, faced chronic food shortages that had reduced civilians to subsisting on turnips and bread adulterated with sawdust. Industrial production struggled with shortages of raw materials. The army itself, though still formidable, had suffered nearly 1 million casualties during the defensive campaigns of 1916 and 1917. If Germany was to achieve victory, it had to be now, before American strength became overwhelming. Operation Michael had opened with spectacular tactical success. German stormtroopers, elite assault troops trained in infiltration tactics and equipped with light machine guns, flamethrowers, and grenades, had pioneered new methods of warfare that bypassed Allied strongpoints rather than becoming bogged down attacking them directly. Following a hurricane bombardment that lasted just 5 hours, carefully timed to achieve surprise rather than the days-long preliminary bombardments that had characterized earlier offensives, these stormtroopers had punched through British lines near St. Quentin. By the end of the first day, German forces had advanced up to 8 miles in some sectors, the greatest single-day advance on the Western Front since the war had devolved into trench stalemate in 1914. For nearly 2 weeks, it appeared that Germany might achieve its objective of splitting the British and French armies and driving the British Expeditionary Force back to the Channel ports. German troops advanced almost 40 miles, capturing enormous amounts of territory and taking 70,000 prisoners. Yet the offensive ultimately stalled short of its strategic objectives. The vital rail junction at Amiens, key to British supply lines, remained in Allied hands. German troops, many of whom had subsisted on meager rations for years due to the naval blockade, stopped to loot captured supply dumps filled with food, wine, and luxuries they had not seen in months. Discipline eroded as hungry soldiers feasted rather than pressing the attack. Supply lines stretched beyond sustainable limits, and German casualties mounted to nearly 250,000 men, losses the Empire could not easily replace. Ludendorff launched 3 more major offensives through the spring of 1918. Operation Georgette, aimed at British positions in Flanders beginning April 9, captured the Messines Ridge and portions of territory won at such terrible cost during the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, but failed to capture the crucial rail hub at Hazebrouck. Operation Blücher, launched May 27 along the Chemin des Dames Ridge, achieved stunning tactical success, driving a salient nearly 60 kilometers deep toward Paris. German long-range artillery began shelling the French capital from 80 miles away, and for a brief moment it seemed Germany might capture Paris itself. Yet once again, the offensive created vulnerable salients without delivering a knockout blow. A fourth offensive, Operation Gneisenau along the Marne River in early June, gained little ground before French counterattacks brought it to a halt. By early July 1918, Ludendorff faced a strategic dilemma. The spring offensives had gained enormous amounts of territory, but at catastrophic cost. German casualties exceeded 800,000 men, including disproportionate losses among the irreplaceable stormtrooper elite who had spearheaded every attack. The army was exhausted, running low on supplies, and increasingly affected by declining morale. American divisions were arriving in France at a rate of 10,000 men per day, and already over 1 million American troops were either in France or en route. Time was running out. Yet Ludendorff believed he still had one viable strategic option: an offensive through Flanders targeting the British Expeditionary Force, if successful, could potentially capture the Channel ports that supplied British armies and force Britain out of the war. However, Allied forces in Flanders were strong and alert. To succeed, Ludendorff needed to draw Allied reserves away from the threatened sector. He decided to launch one more diversionary attack, this time along the Marne River east of Paris, with the secondary objective of capturing the fortress city of Reims. If this offensive succeeded in pulling French reserves southward, he could then strike the decisive blow in Flanders. If it failed, well, Germany's strategic position was already desperate. The plan, designated Operation Marne River by the Germans, called for a 2-pronged attack on either side of Reims. East of the city, 23 divisions from the 1st and 3rd German armies under Generals Bruno von Madras and Karl von Einem would assault French 4th Army positions. West of Reims, 17 divisions of the 7th Army under General Max von Bohlen, supported by the 9th Army, would attack the French 6th Army and attempt to cross the Marne River. Ludendorff hoped to split French forces, capture Reims, and create panic that would force the commitment of reserves from other sectors. But Allied intelligence had pierced the veil of German operational security with remarkable success. French reconnaissance aircraft photographed German troop concentrations and supply buildups. Intercepted radio communications revealed operational details. Captured prisoners disclosed their units' assignments and attack timings. Most dramatically, on July 14, just hours before the offensive was scheduled to begin, French raiding parties captured German soldiers during a preliminary assault who confirmed that the attack would commence at 12:10 the following morning. The Allies knew not just the date, but the hour and even the minute when the German bombardment would begin. General Henry Giraud, commanding the French Fourth Army east of Reims, had studied German infiltration tactics carefully and devised a defense specifically to counter them. Rather than crowding troops into forward trenches where they would be vulnerable to the preliminary bombardment, he adopted defense-in-depth principles. His forward positions were held by minimal forces with orders to resist briefly, then fall back. The main defensive line lay several kilometers behind the front, beyond the range where German stormtroopers could reach it during their initial assault. Heavy artillery was positioned even further back, safe from counter-battery fire. When German guns opened fire at 12:10 on July 15, much of their ammunition fell on nearly empty trenches. West of Reims, where the German 7th Army prepared to cross the Marne, conditions were different. Here the river itself formed the defensive barrier, and Allied troops had to hold the southern bank despite the coming bombardment. The French 6th Army and its attached American divisions braced for the storm they knew was approaching. At exactly 12:10 in the morning, as predicted, the German guns spoke. For 3 hours, over 6,000 artillery pieces hammered Allied positions in one of the most intensive bombardments of the entire war. High explosive shells mixed with gas rounds, forcing defenders into their masks. Buildings collapsed into rubble. Communication wires were severed. Casualties mounted among the troops who had no choice but to endure the barrage. At 4:15 in the morning, with the sky beginning to lighten in the east, the German infantry surged forward. East of Reims, the stormtroopers advanced rapidly through the lightly held forward positions, following their rolling barrage deeper into French territory. But as they approached the main defensive line around 8:30 that morning, they discovered that the French artillery, positioned beyond the reach of German guns, was intact and ready. Accurate French fire tore apart the German assault formations. Attacks launched at noon to break the main line were repulsed with heavy casualties. By the end of July 15, the German offensive east of Reims had been completely stopped, having gained virtually no ground. West of Reims, along the Marne River, the battle unfolded differently. Despite the devastating bombardment, Allied troops on the southern bank held their positions and fought back as German engineers struggled to bridge the river under fire. Stormtroopers crossed in canvas boats, rafts, and any watercraft they could commandeer, attempting to establish footholds on the southern bank. At multiple points along the river, German forces managed to get across and began pushing inland. The American 3rd Infantry Division, holding positions near Diaries, found themselves in the path of the German advance. Many of these soldiers were experiencing their first major battle. They watched as exhausted French units to their flanks began falling back under the pressure of overwhelming German numbers. Some American officers received orders to withdraw to new defensive positions, but the 3rd Division held its ground. At a small village called Fosse, a handful of American machine gunners from the 38th Infantry Regiment established positions covering a bridge across the Marne. As waves of German stormtroopers attempted to cross, the Americans held their fire until the enemy was fully exposed on the bridge, then opened up with devastating effect. German casualties piled up on the narrow span, blocking further attempts to cross. When German artillery targeted their position, the machine gunners simply moved their weapons and continued firing from new locations. For an entire day, this small group of American soldiers prevented vastly superior German forces from crossing at that point. Similar scenes played out at other crossings. The 7th Machine Gun Battalion, attached to the 3rd Division, established interlocking fields of fire along the riverbank. When German boats appeared through the morning mist, American gunners waited until the enemy was midstream before engaging, turning the Marne into a killing ground. One American sergeant, Jesse W. Funk, saw his gun crew killed by German artillery but continued operating his weapon alone, firing until he had expended all his ammunition, then using a pistol to defend his position until relieved. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. The 3rd Division's stubborn defense earned it a nickname that would last throughout its history, the Rock of the Marne. General John J. Pershing, commander of American forces in France, would later describe their stand as one of the most brilliant pages in our military annals. While French units on either flank had been forced to give ground, the Americans held, preventing the Germans from exploiting their crossings and expanding their bridgehead into a decisive breakthrough. By the evening of July 15, despite achieving some tactical successes west of Reims, the German offensive had clearly failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The Germans held a shallow bridgehead south of the Marne, extending perhaps 6 miles at its deepest point, but they had not broken through Allied defenses. Reims remained firmly in French hands. Most critically, the attack had not drawn significant Allied reserves away from other sectors. Ludendorff's diversionary offensive had failed to divert anyone. Over the next 2 days, German commanders desperately tried to expand their gains. Additional divisions were committed to the fight, attempting to push deeper into Allied territory. But Allied resistance stiffened as reinforcements arrived. British troops from the 22nd Corps moved into the line. Italian units, fighting far from home in support of their allies, held crucial defensive positions and repulsed repeated German attacks with heavy losses. 8 large American divisions, including some of the best-trained units in the AEF, joined French forces in containing the German bridgehead. On July 17, after 3 days of costly attacks that gained virtually nothing, the German advance ground to a complete halt. The offensive was over. Germany's last attempt to seize the initiative on the Western Front had failed. But the true significance of the Second Battle of the Marne was about to become apparent. Ferdinand Foch, the French general who served as supreme Allied commander with authority over British, French, American, and Belgian forces, had been planning a major counteroffensive even before the German attack began. While Ludendorff had hoped his Marne offensive would pull Allied reserves southward, Foch had instead been concentrating forces for a devastating counterblow. Now, with the German offensive stalled and German troops overextended in vulnerable salients, the moment for that counterblow had arrived. At dawn on July 18, 1918, Allied forces launched a surprise counteroffensive that would change the course of the war. General Charles Mangin, commanding the French 10th Army, had assembled an overwhelming striking force in the forests near Villers-Cotterêts. 24 French divisions, joined by 8 large American divisions and supported by British and Italian units, faced the western flank of the German salient. Most revolutionary was the armored component. 350 tanks, including the new Renault FT light tanks that were faster and more reliable than earlier tank models. Over 2,000 artillery pieces had been moved into position under cover of darkness. 500 aircraft stood ready to support the attack. The counteroffensive achieved complete surprise. There was no preliminary bombardment to warn the Germans. Instead, at 4:35 in the morning, a massive rolling barrage erupted across the front, and the Allied infantry and tanks surged forward immediately behind the curtain of explosions. The Renault FT tanks, weighing only 7 tons and capable of speeds up to 5 miles per hour, could maneuver through terrain that would have stopped earlier tank models. Their small size and agility made them difficult targets, and they carried either a 37 cannon or a machine gun capable of suppressing enemy strongpoints. The German defenders, exhausted from their own offensive and unprepared for this sudden reversal, were overwhelmed. The French 1st Moroccan Division, one of the elite formations in the French army, advanced rapidly through German positions. American divisions, including the 1st and 2nd, which had seen heavy fighting at Châteaudière and Belleau Wood, broke through German lines with aggressive attacks that combined infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft in coordinated combined arms operations. On the first day alone, Allied forces advanced up to 8 kilometers in some sectors, capturing thousands of prisoners and hundreds of guns. General Pershing, monitoring the battle from American headquarters, reported enthusiastically on his troops' performance. American divisions, he wrote, advanced at a single bound through German defensive positions and overran his artillery. The speed and violence of the Allied advance shocked German commanders who had grown accustomed to the methodical, grinding pace of Western Front warfare. This was something new: mobile, aggressive offensive operations that gave the defenders no time to establish new defensive lines or bring up reinforcements. Over the following days, the Allied counteroffensive expanded. French Sixth Army under General Jean de Gaulle attacked southward from the Marne, pushing German forces back across the river. On July 20, French troops recaptured Châteaudière, the town that had marked the deepest point of the German advance. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau arrived the next day to personally congratulate the troops. By July 27, the entire German salient had been eliminated. The town of Soissons, which anchored the northwestern corner of the salient and had been in German hands since the spring offensive, was liberated on August 2 after fierce fighting. Ludendorff, watching his carefully planned offensive dissolve into chaotic retreat, faced the devastating realization that Germany had lost its last chance for victory. On July 20, he ordered a general withdrawal from the Marne salient. German forces fell back to new defensive positions along the Aisne and Vesle rivers, abandoning all the territory they had captured during their May and July offensives. The withdrawal was conducted in relatively good order, with German rearguards fighting stubbornly to cover the retreat, but the psychological impact was profound. For the first time in months, German soldiers were retreating rather than advancing. The brief moment when victory had seemed possible had passed. The casualty figures told their own grim story. German losses during the Second Battle of the Marne reached approximately 168,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Another 29,000 German soldiers were captured, along with 793 artillery pieces and 3,000 machine guns. French casualties were severe as well, with 95,000 men killed or wounded. British forces suffered 16,000 casualties, American forces 12,000, and Italian forces over 9,000. In the brutal arithmetic of the Western Front, however, these Allied losses could be replaced. American divisions continued arriving in France, fresh troops who had not yet experienced the exhaustion and demoralization of years of fighting. German losses, by contrast, came from a manpower pool that was already depleted and could not be refilled. The strategic consequences of the Second Battle of the Marne extended far beyond the casualty lists and the recovered territory. Most immediately, Ludendorff was forced to cancel his planned Flanders offensive, the operation he had considered Germany's best chance for decisive victory. Without the reserves to launch a major new attack, and with German forces now on the defensive across the entire Western Front, there would be no more German offensives. The initiative had passed irrevocably to the Allies, who would maintain it for the remaining months of the war. The battle shattered German morale at both the front and at home. Soldiers who had been told that the Marne offensive would be the final push to victory instead found themselves retreating from yet another costly failure. Many German commanders, including Crown Prince Wilhelm, privately concluded that the war was lost. Among the German people, news of the defeat after the supposed success of the spring offensives created widespread disillusionment. The sacrifices of 4 years of war seemed to have been for nothing. Industrial workers, already exhausted by long hours and short rations, began to question whether continued resistance made sense. The seeds of the political collapse that would come in November had been planted. For the Allies, the Second Battle of the Marne provided proof that Germany could be defeated. The successful defense had demonstrated that German infiltration tactics could be countered with proper intelligence and defense-in-depth strategies. The devastating counteroffensive showed that Allied forces had learned to coordinate infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft into an effective combined arms system. Most importantly, The involvement of large American forces demonstrated that fresh manpower was arriving from across the Atlantic in quantities that Germany simply could not match. The psychological impact of this realization spread through Allied ranks, replacing the exhaustion and pessimism of previous years with growing confidence. Within weeks of the Marne victory, Foch would launch the next phase of Allied operations. On August 8, 1918, British, Canadian, and Australian forces would attack near Amiens in what Ludendorff would call the Black Day of the German Army. This would begin the 100 Days Offensive, a relentless series of Allied attacks that would drive German forces back across France and Belgium, break through the vaunted Hindenburg Line, and force Germany to seek an armistice just 95 days after the Second Battle of the Marne ended. The Second Battle of the Marne was thus not merely a defensive victory or a successful counterattack. It was the turning point of the entire war on the Western Front. It marked the moment when the strategic initiative passed from Germany to the Allies and never returned. It demonstrated that the arrival of American forces had fundamentally altered the balance of power. It showed that the Allies had mastered the art of modern combined arms warfare. And it proved that Germany, despite its tactical skill and the bravery of its soldiers, could no longer achieve the decisive victory it so desperately needed. From July 18, 1918, forward, the outcome of the First World War was no longer in doubt. The path to the armistice had been opened along the banks of the Marne River, where American soldiers earned the nickname Rock of the Marne, and where Allied tanks rolled forward in the counteroffensive that changed history. If you found this deep dive into the Second Battle of the Marne fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth World War history documentaries. Drop a comment below and let us know which WWI battle you'd like us to cover next. Until next time, remember that understanding these turning points helps us appreciate how profoundly these events shape the world we live in today.